Even as recently as the early 2000s, New Zealand still had a reasonable number of passenger trains, including the Glacier Express from Auckland to Rotorua, the Bay Express from Wellington to Napier, and the Southerner from Christchurch to Invercargill. 25 years later, there's barely any of them left outside Auckland and Wellington, with most of the remaining operational lines being freight only. In this video, which has been the better part of 2 years in the making, I'm going to discuss one of KiwiRail's 3 long-distance passenger services. I decided to focus on the Northern Explorer because I've had more experience on that train than the Transalpine and Coastal Pacific, and I still haven't ridden on the Transalpine at the time of uploading. I get the sense that this video may ruffle some feathers, if you will, so if anyone discusses politics in the comments section, all I ask is for you to simply respect each other's opinions. Auckland and Wellington are the only 2 cities in this country that still have suburban rail networks, but you can still find a few locomotive-hauled regional or long-distance services outside of those cities. Only 5 services to be exact, unless you count the DJ-hauled tourist trains around Dunedin. The Northern Explorer is one of those rare services, and it was introduced in June 2012 to replace the Overlander, not to be confused with the Overland, a twice-weekly service that runs from Adelaide to Melbourne in Australia. In my opinion, the current main trunk service is a bit of a downgrade from what it replaced, at least where the frequency and number of intermediate stops are concerned. So it's a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, with fancy purpose-built coaches but a less frequent service. The Northern Explorer only runs 3 times a week in each direction, northbound as Train 200 on Wednesdays, Fridays and Sundays, then southbound as Train 201 on Mondays, Thursdays and Saturdays. It's the only passenger service that still runs over the full 681 km long route from Wellington to Auckland Strand, with intermediate stops at Padra-Padromu, Palmerston North, Ohakune, National Park, Taumaru Nui, Otorohanga, Hamilton Frankton, and Papakura. The Overlander had a higher number of intermediate stops, even after many were cut in 2005. On their respective running days, the northbound service is scheduled to leave Wellington at 7:55 am and arrive at Auckland Strand at 7 pm, while the southbound service leaves Auckland Strand at 7:45 am next morning and gets to Wellington at 6:25 pm. The Northern Explorer is not the only option for people wanting to go from Auckland to Wellington, or vice versa, without using a car. 2 other options are intercity buses or Air New Zealand flights, with the bus being the cheapest option, but far from the most exciting, in my opinion. The current Wellington railway station opened in 1937, and is now the largest railway station in New Zealand. In addition to the Matangi electric multiple units operating suburban services to Johnsonville, Melling, Upper Hutt and Waikanai, the station is also served by locomotive-hauled trains to Masterton, Palmerston North and Auckland. For the longest time, I liked filming trains at Wellington Station, simply due to the frequency of services coming and going, especially during the morning and evening peak periods, and the scene was made all the more interesting with the locomotive-hauled trains. Sometimes, you'll even see the old DSC class diesel shunters taking empty coaches into or out of the station, as I saw one night in April 2024. Since 2015, the Northern Explorer has used Auckland Strand Station as its northern terminus, having previously used the more conveniently located Britomart station near the foot of Queen Street. In comparison to the grand 9-platform terminus in Wellington, Auckland Strand is a bit of a joke. It looks like a prison yard with the sheer amount of fencing around the platforms, and although the former signal box was refurbished as a station building in December 2023, the station still suffers from its poor location relative to the city centre. There is at least a bus service that connects Queen Street with the Strand station. The bus route in question is number 755. As for motive power on the Wellington to Auckland service, it's provided by KiwiRail's DFB class diesel locomotives. When the Northern Explorer first launched, it was nearly always hauled by one particular example of the smaller DC class, but I don't remember when DFBs took over the job. While I do remember DC 4692 being the service's main motive power, and surprisingly, KiwiRail still use at least 3 photographs of this thing in promotional material, I also have some photographs in my archives of DC 4605 in Hamilton with the AK coaches, taken in November 2012, although I don't actually remember taking these pictures. Neither 4605 nor 4692 are still in service with KiwiRail, as 4692 was sold to Martinus Rail and exported to Australia in 2020. As for 4605, she bowed out in 2022 following a derailment in Auckland, and was eventually exported to Zambia, of all places, in April 2024. The footage you're watching now was recorded in September 2021. Thinking back to the DFB class, 30 of these things were built by General Motors of Canada, with the first batch, comprising 20 locomotives, arriving in 1979, followed 2 years later by the second batch, comprising 10 locomotives. They were originally classified as DF, and came equipped with the same prime movers as the DC class, but in the 1990s, all the DFs were upgraded with turbochargers and reclassified as DFT. Most of the class have since gone through another round of major modifications, and are now classified as DFB, with the B standing for Bright Star, a computerized engine management system. The DFBs have good acceleration and a power output of 2,400 horsepower, which makes them ideal for hauling passenger services. Indeed, that's pretty much the only reason why KiwiRail kept any of them in the North Island instead of casting them off to the South Island. Personally, I quite like the sound of these locomotives, especially when they're going like the clappers with the throttle at notch 8. Despite the majority of the North Island main trunk being electrified, the Northern Explorer is still diesel-hauled for its entire journey. This arrangement, with one locomotive staying on the train for the whole run, is quite a contrast from what was commonplace in the Overlander days, when EF-class electric locomotives would haul the train over the central section. This footage was recorded at Otorohanga in July 2010.
Away.
I can see why KiwiRail doesn't bother swapping engines anymore, but what I would still like to see them try is this. Have an EF already waiting at Palmerston North Station to couple up to the Northern Explorer when she arrives. Then the diesel locomotive is shut down and lets the EF do all the work on the central section, and once they reach Hamilton's Frankton station, the EF can be uncoupled and run light engine to Te Rapa, while the diesel is fired up again to finish the journey to Auckland. The process would be reversed for the southbound trip the next day, and part of me thinks that, if KiwiRail ever tried running an EF on the Northern Explorer, they would never have got the idea from me. Meanwhile, the coaches are a very unusual affair. They're classified in the AK series, but only the base AK and AKC coaches were new builds, while all the support vehicles are rebuilds of older coaches or guards vans. Only 17 AK/AKC coaches were built at Dunedin's Hillside Workshops between 2010 and 2012. This was the first time brand new coaches had been built in New Zealand since 1943. I like how their original livery stands out from any other present-day New Zealand rolling stock, but I'm not a fan of the newer livery at all. Thinking back to the refurbished EFs for a moment, their bright blue livery stands out just as much as the AK coaches, if not more, so I reckon the sight of an EF on the Northern Explorer would be very eye-catching. It might even get people talking outside the railfan community, especially if they're driving along State Highway 1 between Waiuru and just north of Martin and happen to see an EF hauling the AK stock. Each standard AK can seat 63 passengers in a 2x2 configuration, while the AKC is a cafe coach that can only seat 9 passengers. The AKC is a more efficient replacement for the long lunch stops that used to take place at National Park, or Taihape, in the glory days of the Silver Fern railcars. Meanwhile, there are support coaches in the form of the AKL, AKV, AKS, and AKF classes. The AKL is a luggage van, while the AKV is an observation plus generator coach, and both were heavily rebuilt from former FM guards vans, to the point where there is barely anything left of the original FM, a design that first appeared in 1977. I've been on the Northern Explorer enough times to know that the AKV is one of the more popular sections in the consist, and that was also the case on the Coastal Pacific. The one time I rode on that service was on the 22nd of April 2023, when I did a day trip from Christchurch to Picton and back, with DXR 8007 doing the honours. As for the AKS and AKF, they are actually former British Rail Mark II coaches that were originally refurbished as the SA class for Auckland commuter service. After their replacement by electric multiple units, some of the SA coaches and SD cab cars have since been refurbished a second time for a small variety of purposes, including Te Huia and the updated Capital Connection. The AKS, of which KiwiRail has at least 3 examples, is a luggage van, while the AKF is a bizarre kitchen coach currently used on all 3 of the tourist services. Passengers who can somehow afford the Scenic Plus option are able to order restaurant-quality meals cooked on board the AKF, while riding aboard a refurbished AK that's now designated as AKP, and painted in a livery that I don't particularly like. I remember one morning when I saw the crew at Christchurch's Addington station wheeling trolleys full of food along the platform. The trolleys were loaded aboard AKF 6112, which was part of the Transalpine consist that day. It wasn't until September 2024 when the Northern Explorer started running with an AKF in the consist. Typically, the Northern Explorer consists of one AKV, 2 AKs, 1 AKC, and 1 AKP followed by the AKF and AKS. That's the order from front to back when the train's heading south. The AK and AKC coaches, and by extension the AKP refurbishment, were essentially tailor-made for the long-distance tourist services, with huge panoramic windows, uncomfortably small headphones that can be plugged into sockets by the seats for an audio commentary, and various other amenities. If I recall correctly, the seats are perfectly fine, but they're nothing to write home about, and I hated the onboard experience when the train was busy because I'm not comfortable with being in a cramped space near lots of other people, especially when they're all chatting away. Indeed, when I was heading back to Christchurch aboard the Coastal Pacific, a big tour group boarded in Blenheim, and I had to move along and sit in the AKC because the noise from all the people talking was too overwhelming. To be fair, I've always found the staff on the Northern Explorer to be friendly people. Of course, their main concern is helping the passengers, but when the opportunity presents itself, they're happy to chat about various aspects of the railways, be it their history or current operations. I wonder how often they get knowledgeable railfans on the train, instead of the usual tourists who know bugger all about the railway itself. One thing I don't like about the Northern Explorer is the Spartan timetable. There is only one set of coaches allocated to the service, and KiwiRail never built enough AK coaches to run a more frequent service. Unlike the Transalpine and Coastal Pacific, the Northern Explorer's route is too long for a round trip to be completed within just one day. As an aside, there was one time when I swear I overheard one of the passengers talking about wanting to see a high-speed railway line down the North Island, on par with the likes of Germany's Hanover to Würzburg line. Now I like high-speed trains as much as the next guy, but even I realise that they would be completely impractical for a country with such a small population as New Zealand. The ticket prices on KiwiRail's long-distance tourist services are really off-putting, especially given the absence of a discount for New Zealand residents. For example, it currently costs a staggering $299 for one adult to travel on the Northern Explorer from Auckland Strand to Wellington, and that's without getting Scenic Plus as well. Auckland to Wellington with the Scenic Plus option would set you back a ludicrous $629. Of course, the prices vary depending on the distance you intended to travel, but they're still not cheap in any case. The standard tickets do not include complimentary food or drinks. Instead, they have to be acquired separately aboard the AKC Cafe coach. I've never tried Scenic Plus, so I can't really comment on it, but I don't see why I can't question its ridiculous price. One could say that a staple part of the journey is trying to buy some refreshments in the AKC, only to realise that you're in an area with poor reception, of which there are several, especially between Hamilton and Palmerston North. In those cases, the EFTPOS machine won't work, and I suggest bringing some cash with you to avoid that kind of situation. Either that, or waiting until you get back into an area with good enough reception. The whole process of booking a ticket for the Northern Explorer feels very similar to an airline, albeit with the frustrating lack of an option to select your own seat in the train's case. Unlike domestic flights with Air New Zealand, such as the Tauranga to Christchurch service for example, you can't check in online for the Northern Explorer. Instead, you can only do in-person check-ins at the station. Personally, I think this is not an ideal way to do things. I remember going through this process at Hamilton's Frankton station, and the ticket they give you is actually called a boarding pass, as if this were a sodding airline. Knowing full well that the Northern Explorer is aimed at the tourist market above all else, I think that, ideally, there should be a second service introduced on the main trunk that is significantly cheaper while stopping at more stations, including, but not limited to, Porirua, Otaki, Fielding, Martin, Taihape, Te Kuiti, Te Awamutu, Huntly, and Pōkeno. I mentioned the town of Pōkeno despite knowing that you would need to build a station there first, as the town doesn't currently have one, despite being on Te Huia's route. As it stands, the scenery and local attractions are the main features of the Northern Explorer's marketing, and that contrasts with what I think would be ideal for a conventional public transport service. Said idea would be for the advertising to focus on the train's ability to connect people to other towns in a safe and reliable manner. You can already see that sort of marketing in use for Te Huia. Regarding tickets on a hypothetical Auckland to Wellington train that runs more frequently and stops at more stations, I reckon it would make sense for them to be priced at a level that's competitive with the intercity buses. Come to think of it, the train would need to be more comfortable than the buses and all. As for rolling stock on such a service, the only idea of which I could think was to use some of the SA and SD coaches that used to be stored in Taumaru Nui, complete with a refurbishment similar to Te Huia and the Capital Connection. But, of course, the coaches would have to be better equipped for a long-distance journey. Given the current political climate in New Zealand, I realised that it would be highly unlikely for regular passenger trains to ever return to, say for instance, the Hamilton to Tauranga line, but I don't see anything wrong with still holding out even a small amount of hope for things to change for the better. At present, I am of the opinion that what's left of this country's rail network is not being used to its full potential. I also think that KiwiRail should at least try to spruce up what's left and work harder to reduce the amount of traffic, particularly trucks, on our roads. While there are still some parts of the rail network that are decently busy, they're not very common outside the cities that make up the Golden Triangle, not to mention the cities of Wellington and Christchurch. In summary, I believe that the Northern Explorer does a decent job at being a tourist train, but the problem is that it is so specifically optimised for rich tourists that it's borderline useless for anyone else. I don't think the service should be outright cancelled. It ought to keep going for as long as possible. But if we never get an Auckland to Wellington train that's just focused on being a public transport service, then, at the very least, a local discount on the Northern Explorer should be introduced for New Zealand residents. I would also suggest to KiwiRail that they give passengers the option to A. select their own seats when booking their tickets, and B. check in online instead of only being able to check in at the stations. In saying all of that, I'm not the kind of person to throw my toys out the pram if those ideas are never implemented, let alone even considered. At this point, and especially after a fairly rocky last 33 years, I'm happy that my country still has any rail services at all.